gray one is this.
You got your gray cards out. Now we're going to talk about all of these, from remember to create. But what I want you to understand about blooms is that I'm not telling you necessarily that this is hierarchy. I'm not telling you that. Old blooms would have maybe told you that. I'm telling you no, not necessarily. It depends on what you are asking the kid to do. Because there may be times when you are asking them to analyze something before they can really understand it. Okay? So don't think of this as you got to go from here to here to here to here. You can jump around any way you want to that makes sense with the kids that you're working with. So it's more than just the different words that we're using. It's the idea of the intent of what you want the kids to do. So again, I tell you, don't just rely on the verbs that you're using. Rely on what your kids are actually doing. This gives you a lot of gerunds. You know, those of you who are the English language arts people, gerunds, the ing words as we teach our kids. There are lots of them here. And they're not, everything you do is not on here. But it gives you some really good examples. The first one we start with, remember, which is retrieving relevant knowledge from long-term memory, and maybe you want them to memorize it exactly as you told it to them. Recognizing is different than recalling. It's much easier to recognize something than it is to recall it. If you give me 3 choices on an answer, I have a much better chance of recognizing the correct one than I do of recalling it. And so before, you have to kind of think which one is it you really want kids to be able to do. And then the idea is, do you want them to be able to retain this? Retention is the key of this information that you're giving them. And usually when you retain it, you want them to be able to do it, have the same information, but use it later someplace else. Which takes you to transfer. And transfer is getting a little bit more complicated. And I will tell you, as a teacher for many years of younger kids and even middle school kids, the transfer was the hardest thing. You could teach them the stuff. They could memorize it, do it here, but they couldn't transfer it into a different setting. I mean, I've had kids who actually, I tell this story because it's honestly true, working with kids on sounds. This was kindergarten, had them all down, did it really well. I sat out in the hallway with them. You know, we went through all of them. We had it nailed. Next day we came together. We had to work in the library. The change in the venue of the place interrupted the flow of where it was. I know that seems impossible, but it was the absolute truth. Just changing the environment for that kid. Couldn't pull it back up. Yeah, okay. So you get the idea. The second one is understand. Look at how many there are under understand. Interpreting, exemplifying, classifying, summarizing, inferring, comparing, explaining. This is where you spend a lot of your time, folks, is in teaching kids to understand. And how many objectives have you seen written? The student will understand blah. The student will understand blah. Okay, but what are they going to do to show you that they understand it? How do they understand it? Are they going to explain it to you? Are they going to draw a picture? What is it that you're doing to get them to show you that they understand? There's all of these examples. I have to tell you one that kind of, when all my years of teaching, I always thought, you know, when you're teaching kids to infer knowledge, I always thought that was a much higher level concept than a 2, you know, as far as on the scale. Because inferring is a difficult thing. They've got to read the text and then they've got to draw connections and conclusions from that and infer. And I think that was one of the hardest things to teach. So therefore, I thought it would be a little bit more difficult on the scale, but it's not. It's still within the confines of understanding. And I think you'll find that kind of interesting, that all of these verbs in here that you thought would be a little bit more complex are simply under the word understand, which is not bad. I'm not saying anything is bad. I just want you to realize that that's where they fall. Okay, the third step, of course, and the third one is apply, carrying out or using a procedure in a given situation. They break it down into executing and implementing. When you execute, you're using a procedure on a familiar task. Like, I teach double-digit subtraction, and I use the same process on every problem that you give me across the row. But implementing is using a procedure on an unfamiliar task. Maybe I have a story problem, maybe I have something else where I have to choose which procedure I'm going to use, and it's not the same one I saw before. That's implementing. A little bit more complicated than just executing. It kind of, like, again, it depends on how you're using it. So please understand that I understand that when you do it, it might be differently depending on what you're asking the student to actually do. Analyze. Again, We're breaking it down. You break the material into its constituent parts to determine how the parts relate to a whole. It can be differentiating, organizing, or attributing. Now, because we're at Analyze, which is one of the more complicated ones, this is what I want you to do on Analyze, because I know you do facts, I know you do understand, I know you do apply. Now I want you to think about where in your classroom last year or planning next year are you going to teach your kids to analyze something? Oh dear. Just think a minute. I know it's not easy to pull that up, but I want you to talk about that a little bit and think about what do you do that teaches kids to analyze something? Okay? Just talk at your tables. I'm not going to call on you, don't worry. Where do you teach kids to differentiate, organize, or attribute? Mm-hmm.
Just give them an idea of what they're thinking about it.
Social studies, like how did what happened in history affect the way we live now, or change things?
Reading all the time, reading point of view. Was the author once